Last December, the New York Times stunned readers with the magnificent Snowfall, a breathtaking multimedia narrative that showed the possibilities of long-form journalism on the web. In Snowfall, John Branch tells the harrowing story of 16 skiers caught in an avalanche that took place in February 2012 in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. It's a 6-part story accompanied by interactive graphics, video, and character bios of the skiers and snowboarders caught in the avalanche. The story was widely hailed as the future of online reading, the Times' first bold leap into experience-based feature. It was also the Times' first foray into the e-publishing of long-form singles. Snowfall, as you can see here, opens with this otherworldly video loop of snow blowing across a mountain slope. Then comes the text, beginning with an action-packed lead that foreshadows what comes next, a story of suspense and heartbreak told with perfect pacing and in riveting detail. But Snowfall is not just a well-told story. It's also, in the words of the New Yorker, an investigation into the hazards of group decision-making and the insidious role that peer pressure, deferral to authority, and presumption of expertise can play in undermining intelligence and experience. To report this story, John Branch interviewed every survivor, researched the world of backcountry skiing, traveled to Alaska to speak with snow scientists, read accident reports, and even hiked the terrain himself. What makes this story so powerful is the recollection, in their own words, of each of the skiers. The Times has short video excerpts of each of them. One of them, Elise Saugstad, says this memorable line: "It was like being in a washing machine. I didn't know which way was up, which way was down. Is this the way I am going to die?" Avalanche has 15,000 words, generated 1,100 comments online, and readers spent an average of 12 minutes on the story, a record on the internet of short attention spans. It was also published in a 14-page special section of the newspaper. The Times does have a newspaper, 2 days before Christmas last year. So John Branch, how did you find this story?
Well, thank you. I didn't know about this when it happened, and I got a call probably 2 months later. When it did happen, we assigned a freelancer based in Colorado to write a story. In fact, this avalanche happened on the same day as another fatal avalanche in Washington. And so the freelancer wrote a very Timesian A1 story that said, these 2 avalanches on Sunday in Washington are part of a bigger picture. You can sort of picture the lead that we typically put on these things. Part of a bigger picture of avalanches that have proven deadly this winter. At that point, there had been a higher number than usual of avalanche deaths. And so it was a next day kind of story, and about 2 months later, I got a call from my editor who said, "Do you remember that story, that avalanche?" And I said, "Yeah, not really." And he said, "You know what, I think there's something more there. If indeed more and more people are headed to the backcountry, enticed by changes in equipment, enticed by open gate policies of ski areas, and if indeed more people are dying in avalanches, there's got to be a way to look at this in a different way, not just a next day kind of way." And so we talked about it, and I think we both came to the pretty quick conclusion that the best way to do that would be to shine maybe a very narrow beam onto the broader issue, and I loved it. The work you guys did, as big of an issue as pipelines are, your story is probably much more interesting, focused on one pipeline, and in part on one person, as opposed to, let's do a big story on pipelines around the world. So sort of with that same mantra in mind, we said, let's find an avalanche. And it became pretty clear that the one in Tunnel Creek was probably the one to do, because not only was it the most deadly of the season, it was also one in which there were a lot of survivors and witnesses. And most avalanches kill the people that set them off, and they don't have a lot of witnesses.
So it's one thing to find an avalanche, it's another thing to report it. How do you report on an avalanche that took place, like several months after, before you even thought there was a story there?
Yeah, nothing like reporting a story on avalanches in the middle of the summer. The first thing I did was, besides doing some very basic going back and seeing what was written about this was to make a couple of calls to people who were in the avalanche. And I just started calling them, and I didn't know what kind of response I would get, certainly. It had been 2 or 3 months since the avalanche. I would assume that they were tired of thinking about it, talking about it. They didn't know me from anybody. And here's another guy, just another reporter calling them saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you again. Can we go over it all again? And fortunately, the first 2 calls were Megan Michelson and John Stifter. Both of them are actually members of the media, and they responded to my request within an hour or 2. And I had them both on the phone for several hours each, going minute by minute through what happened that day. And, you know, at the time, I assumed that I would be able to get hopefully a few people to talk about the avalanche, but I'm very proud of the fact that in the end, all of them, we figured out who was there, which was a trick in its own. And in the end, they all spoke. But I do think it took a certain amount of trust, and it certainly, this is a horrible analogy, snowballed to some extent that I talked to them, and when I went to make the next call for the next person, they were certainly calling them and saying, hey, Megan, what do you think of this guy? You know, I don't want to talk about this again. What do you think of this guy? And fortunately, over the course of a couple of months, they all agreed to talk.
So how do you talk about something, you know, tragic like this? How do you even begin the conversation?
You know, the thing I did with them is just ask them if they would just walk me through the entire weekend. I believe it happened on a Sunday, and so I said, you know, why were you there at Stevens Pass? You know, tell me when you got there. Thursday, Friday, what were you doing? Walk me through Saturday. When, and really minute by minute. And it was a little bit excruciating for some of them to really kind of recall everything that led up to the event. But one of my first missions was to sort of build a timeline of what happened. You know, after you get 10 or 12 or 13 people talking about the same event, I was trying to think, well, if you guys left that group, at what point did the avalanche occur? Where were you when this happened? It became a little bit of a feat in trying to really figure out chronologically exactly where people were on the mountain at exactly what time. There were some GoPro camera footage. There were text messages. There were 911 calls. There were some ways I could sort of construct a timeline, and that's what I did first, is basically took all the information from the interviews and cut and pasted all their quotes about what they were doing at each moment and cut it into a huge file.
So your chronology was minute by minute?
Was as close to minute by minute as possible.
Wow.
Yeah, and once I got to the avalanche, yes. So the interviews were all very, very detailed. I wanted to know every minute by minute what happened.
But you did more than interviewing. You did other things to get this story done. You even went to an international snow science workshop.
Yeah, which I didn't know that existed. At the International Snow Science Workshop, which I missed in Grenoble, France recently, I don't know why I didn't get to go to the next one, was in Anchorage last year. And there are 700 or 800 snow scientists from around the world that convene. It's an entire world unto its own. It's not all people who are interested in backcountry skiers. A lot of them are people who are into construction of railroads and highways, and people who are town planners in mountain communities who are trying to figure out, can we build here, or are we just setting ourselves up for danger? It's a fascinating world, but yeah, it's been 4 or 5 days at a conference. And
then you climbed the same mountain.
Well, yeah, what was interesting is that where this avalanche took place is really difficult to get to. You know, you can't get to it in the summer. The lifts aren't running, for one thing. But the ski area at one point did open up the lift for me, and I went down there with 2 guys. We went to the top, hiked up to where the top were these guys, and then we hiked down as far as we could down into the ravine. And separately, I started at the bottom and hiked up from the bottom. I really just wanted to get a sense of the terrain, and it's brutal. I mean, I'm from Colorado. I think I know mountains a little bit, and it was really difficult, treacherous terrain, and it really was kind of a funnel. I mean, you could sort of see both the allure of it, because it was beautiful, but also the treachery of it.
So this project took 6 months, a team of multimedia and visual journalists, 14 pages, 15,000 words. That's a lot. I mean, isn't this, I don't mean this in this way, isn't it a bit of overkill?
Absolutely. You know what? We get that question a lot. And I'm probably the wrong person to answer it. You know, when I started, it was go do a story about an avalanche. It began very organically. Steve, who will, I think, talk about this in a few minutes, knows that I basically took this file of interviews that I had, that were all basically cut and spliced into a chronological story, or a chronological thing of 30,000 words. And at some point I went to my editor and said, just in case you're wondering if I've been busy the last few weeks, I sort of felt guilty, like they haven't heard from me in weeks. And I sent them that file. And they read through it, and they actually, for a time, thought we could almost run this, just nothing but people talking about it. It was 30,000 words. That would have been a little much. But anyway, they passed that file, which is kind of unusual for us. They passed it on to other departments, including Steve, including the video department, our photo editor, and said, hey, John Branch is working on this. We think there's something potentially powerful, and we're going to go pretty big on this, we think. Are you guys interested? And to Steve's great credit, Steve said, yes, of course, we'll do it.
Okay, Steve, why don't you come up and show us how you did it? Take us behind the scenes of Snowfall.
So I'll just run through the presentation of it and give you a little bit of the backstory. It does start with this kind of signature moving still. It was one of a series of short videos that Catherine Spangler edited. She was the main video editor on the piece. And so with the top of the piece, we just try to keep things as minimal as possible. You don't see navigation until you scroll down a little bit. And the general idea was just to push the multimedia as close as possible to the words. Here we'll see Elise talk for a little bit.
I had no ability to control what was happening to me. I was being tossed over and over and over. It was like being in a washing machine. I didn't know which way was up. I didn't know which way was down. I couldn't see anything. There were times when I couldn't breathe because there was so much snow, and it was just like void of air. I definitely thought that after being caught in it for a little while, holy moly, this may be the end. This is it. Are you serious? This is really the way I'm going to die?
So then you continue to scroll and you kind of get to this section that is really, I think, one of the better moments where the browser starts to darken and you're reading about the Cascade Mountain Range and then you're in the Cascade Mountain Range. And this is a motion graphic created by a member of the graphics department, Jeremy White. It's just a digital elevation model that he extruded and then he draped satellite imagery over that, and there were some other effects he applied to it, and then he created the animation. But the sort of merging of words with multimedia was really the main sort of conceptual leap, and it started, here. Sort of a simple idea. So those black horizontal bars represent multimedia elements, and the vertical bars represent words. And it was a little bit of a leap because ordinarily this is how we present multimedia. There's a written story, and then there are what some people refer to as bells and whistles. We don't refer to them that way. Along the side, but they're separate. No matter how compelling the multimedia elements are, they're unto themselves and not part of what people in the newsroom talk about as the story. So the idea here was to not have separate stories, but to have one story, and to create, only multimedia where it was going to be, function as connective tissue between sections of John's story. And so I'll show you another part of the piece. It starts out with another sort of moving still, and then here we show you a reconstruct, basically, of the Avalanche. It was something that we created from data, actually. So we show you where the skiers were on the mountain, and include some contour lines. And so we added a little sound. The sound actually there's a little data component to the sound because it's ticking off every time it it crosses another 100 feet. A little annotation on the speed. So you get the idea. And, it started with this. Actually, I think the source we worked with someone John found was this Swiss group that does avalanche research, and they do modeling of avalanches. And we had a lot of information, the physical attributes of this. We had the sort of width of the crack and the depth, and we had this very detailed elevation model, so we knew the slope and variations in the slope, and so we passed them our data and the model that we created, and they started to actually create an animation out of it. And so they gave us the velocity and the height of this at different positions down the slope of the mountain, and then we mapped that to our 3D model. You can sort of see the stages of it here, and then we started to kind of stylize it and simplify it so that it became something that was understandable, and then we included scales and annotation to make it a little bit more meaningful. That was it.
Thank you. So we'll take a few minutes of questions on Avalanche and then open it up to the entire panel. All right, there's an avalanche of questioners here. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, Jenny again. Yeah, of course, everyone saw this when it came out, and people are still continuing to talk about it simply because we haven't seen it duplicated yet. Can you talk to us a little bit about, maybe Steve, what are the challenges, costs associated with everything that goes into making a project like this, and why maybe it is such a special thing right now, and we haven't seen something like this since last December?
Well, there were a lot of challenges, although at the time it didn't seem that difficult. We had a lot of time to work on it. There was no real peg, and we kind of kept pushing back the publication date because we were developing assets and, became more and more confident that they were going to be good and that we had a good idea for how we were going to put it all together. I think, the challenge in repeating it is that, we turn around stories pretty quickly, even stories that have a lot of people working on them, even stories where we're, creating a lot of multimedia. And, with this piece, it was sort of a luxury to have the amount of time that we did. And so it let us, try things out and have those things not work. And with other projects, we're having to turn them around so quickly that it's hard to experiment the degree that we did with this project.
Yes, on that side?
Hi, I have absolutely no digital training, and I'm a reporter, but every time I look at this project, I wonder, what did John Branch do? And I see that there was a huge team that was supporting him. But as far as we are concerned, when there is this growing, concern about being a one-man army and being able to produce something like this, what can you do? What kind of skills can you learn to produce something as terrific as that? And how do you go about it?
Well, there were maybe a dozen people working on this. So, there was a video editor, there was a photographer, Ruth Fremson, great photographer. There were 3D modelers and animators. Which path would you like to go down? And of course, it was all tied to what John was doing. None of this would have happened if, we didn't have a great story. If there wasn't the sort of openness that John had with his reporting, the sort of raw reporting that he opened up and gave us a start creating some of the multimedia elements. I think that was like a crucial things. So, as a reporter, certainly one thing to take on in thinking about how these things become possible is to not be so guarded about material, and that there are others who can contribute, elements that will improve the quality of the piece ultimately.
I've sort of joked that you should probably try to be born like 10 years later, because if you can help it, because I'd imagine some of these graphics that took days or weeks to construct in 10 years might take a shift. and maybe they'll be so easy in some way. I mean, I think we'll laugh back, we'll look back at this and kind of laugh at how long it took and how everybody seemed to love it at the time, and now it'll look quaint at some point, as hard as that might be to believe. But no doubt, I think with technology, and Steve knows better than anybody, I think it's changing so quickly that people will be able to do this kind of thing probably sooner than we realize.
Yes, please.
I have two quick questions. One is, when you were sort of building the narrative and actually structuring the piece online, what was the ideation behind putting certain multimedia elements at a certain place? I thought that was quite interesting in terms of how the entire thing was curated. So just something on that. And the second thing is the idea, sort of this being touted as the model for multimedia journalism going forward. 6 months, 15 people, I don't know how much money was spent on it. It's something pretty much the New York Times or the Washington Post can afford. I don't think most of the other newspapers here can afford to put that sort of resource. Given that, do you, having created this, really think this is the model for multimedia journalism going ahead?
So I'll just answer your first question and just give you a little backstory. When we started to talk about the multimedia for the project, when we launched, we behaved the way that we ordinarily do. We wanted to make a model of the mountain. We thought there was a graphic that would be separate from John's piece, that we would make some kind of a simulation of a recreation of the Avalanche. We started to see video and some of the photography and the models, the graphics that we were making started to improve, and we kind of realized that they were going to be pretty strong, and started to talk about what we were going to do with all of this material. The idea surfaced that we would try to bring them all together, and we thought that meant, changing some of the written story, that we would want the multimedia to be like connective tissue, to be a part of the story. And so we sort of presented this idea to Joe Sexton, who was the sports editor, and Jason Solomon, who is now the sports editor, and said, look, in order for this to work, in order to bring all of this together and make a story, it means editing. It means us editing the multimedia so that when you experience it, it is like reading, and it means us editing your words so that they lead you into the multimedia in a very natural way. And Joe Sexton said, no way. That was it. And so then it took a couple of weeks, to let him mull it over, and I think ultimately, I don't even know how he became convinced that it was maybe a good idea. But he said yes, and then in the end we actually didn't end up changing any of John's words. We got a draft, and the stuff that the pieces we were making fell in line sort of just right in different places, and it became obvious where to put things because of the way John structured the narrative. Things just seemed, they were logical, they were a good fit in different places. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
John, the question was, is this the model? Is this the future?
No,
or is it only for the times?
So I think Snowfall is not really a model. I mean, the way that we made that project has not been a model really for projects that are sort of similar that we have done since. Except the idea. This year we've run projects on. There was a science piece on the quest to find the Higgs boson, and there has been a series by Libby Rosenthal about the cost of healthcare in this country, and we did a piece recently. A reporter took a trip from St. Petersburg to Moscow and sort of documented her story and what she found along the way in a similar way, and it was at a lower scale. And so we're turning around this idea of bringing the multimedia into the written piece and editing the multimedia so that it is not sort of take you on a tangent, and also thinking about seriously, talking about and at times doing it, changing the written story so that it can accommodate. Those are the lasting, sort of effects. So in terms of it being a model, it has become sort of a model, but not the level of production that Snowfall had.
So, on that side, please. Yeah.
John, you said your editor assigned you to this story, but can you talk a little bit about finding a story that already has been done and identifying that there really is a lot more there, and how to report on it in a way that we still care and that's not repetitive?
Yeah, you're right, because it had been done. And in fact, during the reporting for this, I found out that Megan was writing a first-person account. And of course, at this point, multimedia might have been involved. And I said, great, we're going to be writing a story that we have nothing, that we are going to try to report months later. And meanwhile, there's going to be a first-person account in Outside Magazine of somebody who was actually there. How am I going to compete with that? I think the key was that we were willing to kind of go deep. That's another Avalanche cliche metaphor. We were willing to do more than just a news story. We really were invested in doing, we want to know the emotions. We want to know exactly how it all came together. We wanted to weave together 16. It turns out to be 16 different stories, basically, and try to weave them together. There aren't a lot of news organizations that are probably going to do that. 17, I think it was closer to 17,000 words. And there was some debate in the newsroom whether it's actually the longest story, single story that the Times has ever run. You don't go into a story thinking it's going to be 17,000 words, but it just sort of evolved that way. And I think that's kind of the key here, is that we didn't have any preconceived notions with the story or with the multimedia. This all just sort of grew, and to use that word again, it really did snowball. It's like, this is good. And fortunately, there were editors, and Steve being one, and Joe Sexton being one, and Jason Stallman, and then ultimately Jill Abramson, who said, this is so good, we're not going to mess with it. Keep going.
Yes, please.
This is a question more for John, and you've touched on this a little bit, I think, in some of your responses, but I was wondering if you could talk, having gone through this project, if or how that has affected your compositional process or how you think about a story, having had your text, become the basis for this much bigger collaborative multimedia project than had been seen before?
The short answer is that it didn't. I had written most of this. I had that huge kind of chronological draft of all the interviews, and I used that as kind of the skeleton for how I built a story. In the end, I ended up doing it mostly chronological. So in some ways, don't tell the Pulitzer Board this. This was kind of easy to write once I had all that reporting done, because it was kind of chronological and it followed what I'd already kind of constructed with the reporting. I did get the phone call. I live in California now. I did get the phone call from Jason Stallman saying, you just missed an interesting meeting. Steve says, you got to trust us. We want to build these multimedia components. What it might mean is that you might need to change some of the transitions. We might need to cut some of John's text to try to make it all work so that the graphic elements basically replace the words. It's all going to be one blended thing. To which Joe Sexton, I can't believe he said something without a lot of swear words. But and so he basically had my back. And so there was discussion whether or not we were going to really blend and sort of make and have the writer write this differently because of multimedia. In the end, nothing changed. I don't know if that's happened since then. I'm involved in a couple projects now that I could potentially see we would write it for the multimedia.
Yeah, that was my question, is has it changed your compositional process now?
It hasn't. I'm working on something now that Steve and I were talking about before this that I could see. I'll go into it writing it, maybe it's a bunch of vignettes, and I'm picturing how it would work in multimedia as opposed to one long narrative. I think we're right at that cusp. I think this is an interesting time because as reporters, I think we are now, I've always thought about what can we do to add video to this or a photographer? What kind of graphics would be useful in this? But as Steve showed, that used to be separate little things. And now we're blending them together. You have to think about how it's going to work out. And I think we're kind of at that point. And it'll be interesting to see over the next, 5 or 10 years as more and more reporters sort of get told, guess what, your text is changing because of whatever. And there was talk early on, not to belabor the point, but there was talk early on, for example, about whether some of my quotes would get cut, some of the quotes would get cut, in favor of that person actually talking. And I think we're not quite there yet with all of a sudden somebody's head popping up and voice coming on. I don't, you notice you still have to click on the play button. And I think, maybe the reader's not quite ready to have somebody just suddenly start talking, or maybe they don't have the volume turned up, But those are the kinds of discussions that we're having.
June?
There's a quote making the rounds among the executive classes of the media that this project costs damn near $1 million, and because of that, the Times would never do anything this extensive again. I'm not going to ask you to verify that quote or not, but can you talk about the lessons that you learned, both of you, from doing this and how you're applying it to the projects that you're working on now that do involve multimedia?
I don't see how it costs that much. I mean, this was going on. I mean,
So was it $1 million?
well, so the group that built the project on the web did not work on this exclusively. I mean, there were other projects that we were juggling. It was 2012, so we had a presidential election, and there were a lot of news events we had to cover as well. So it wasn't something that we weren't just spending our time working on this.
Yeah, if there's one regret I have in terms of a line in the story, it's actually the postscript, which said 16 people worked on this for 6 months. Some of those people worked on it for a few days. Some people did it off and on over the course of a couple months. I was probably the only one that was involved to some degree for 6 months. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think fortunately we happened to work someplace where the two of us at least, didn't have to worry about the cost of it. Somebody above us did. I don't know, we maybe just didn't tell them what we were doing. I don't know exactly how that all worked out. I don't think anybody's added up how much did this cost. I don't know if there's a way to add that up. And I certainly know that we are not going to try to write stories to make money. We see this in a much broader picture than that. If you had to go out and sell a story to make money for the New York Times, most of our stories would not get written.
Well, can you talk about the lessons that you learned in the process of making it? You said that you've done, I guess this is a question for Steve, how have you brought what you learned from making Snowfall to the projects that you've done since on the
So the lessons learned, I think, extend beyond the graphics department or the video desk or the photo desk to the newsroom generally. I mean, it goes back to what John was saying, where he's now thinking about stories a little bit differently. I think the project and some of some similar projects that we've done since then have caused reporters to want to be involved in the creation of visual elements and has generated discussion around the newsroom about how, the value of those elements. And so I think the lessons learned are just a sort of shift in the culture in the newsroom, so that it's not, we're still obviously going to be generating thousands and thousands of words in the New York Times, but, I think there's going to be a lot more consideration sort of given to the value of visual, sort of interactive journalism going forward.
Yes.
You just talked about, or you just said that you don't write stories to make money, which is kind of a comfortable position you put yourself in, because if small newsrooms want to tell long-form and multimedia stories, they need to make money. And I wondered if you at any point talked about advertisement, generating advertisement revenue, because I think advertisement would kind of decrease the quality of the piece. And so, I mean, there's the model the Edivist has where you pay per article. What other ways could you think of, or would you think are possible to make those stories generate money and to finance them?
Yeah, my point about the money, I want to be clear, is that I don't think we would be in a good position if we set out to write a story and this individual story needs to make money. That's probably not a story most people want to read. It's I'd hope to think that we would like to look at it in a bigger picture, where the collection of stories that we produce will get subscribers, will get advertisers, that sort of thing. It was interesting, and Steve probably knows more about this than I do, but it was interesting to have a meeting with our new publisher shortly after Snowfall came out. There were discussions during the making of this about advertising and whether advertising should be sprinkled in. In the end, there were, 4?
Just a few ads.
Yeah, there's a few ads that kind of go across. 2 weeks later, we had a meeting with the publisher and our new CEO, Mark Thompson, and we were talking about all this, and he said, "You guys, I loved it. I'm the new CEO. I absolutely loved what you did, but why in the hell did you guys put ads in it?" Which is not something you would think a CEO would say, but his point was, there should have been, maybe we gummed it up a little bit you had something beautiful and maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe there's a different way to look at it. Maybe we could have sold a sponsorship for it. Or maybe you just have what might be a lost leader. This is going to bring attention, positive attention to the New York Times. It'll get subscribers in that way. You won't actually see the money. No accountant can figure out how much money did this cost and how much did it make.
So we did, I'll just mention that we did run a long form piece this summer about, it was a profile of a jockey, and that piece was sponsored by BMW. But the people generating the piece didn't have a lot to do with selling the article. I mean, it's not our jobs to sell it, it's our jobs to sort of make the stories.